In order to help you see blockchain's biggest use case, I have to ask you a question. Does anyone here have number 31? Okay, let me rephrase the question. Does anyone here have the 31st human right? Well, you can't. I'm glad no one raised their hands. That would have been really weird. Because there are actually only 30 human rights in the world. Everyone watching this video and everyone in this audience today has 30 human rights. Now, these human rights are bestowed upon all humans as they're born on the planet. Human rights feel normal, but they were not always here. They started a couple of thousand years ago, and there was a defining moment when Cyrus the Great declared on a scroll that all humans have freedom of choice. This was about 2,500 years ago. And this scroll actually exists today. It's in museums. It rotates across the world. And it's a representation of the first thought that we can have human rights as a human being. Now, how do we go from there to the 30 we have today? Well, it took about 2,500 years and a lot of debate and discussion and formation of organizations such as the United Nations until 1948, when the United Nations ratified 30 human rights for all human beings. The rights are kind of awesome. They're like, you have the right to rest, which means that you can't be enslaved forever. You could take rest. You have the right to protest. They're the basic things that we need. They were made in a form of government called centralization. Centralization, in its basic form, suggests that we don't know how to behave. And as a result, we should have some form of central government with power in order to tell us how to behave and then enforce our behavior. Everyone here has experienced centralization. It starts with your parents when you're young, your governments, your religious leaders. It's all a centralized formation. Now, centralization feels permanent, but it in itself is not. It's actually fairly new. Prior to centralization, we were decentralized beings. I could walk into your cave, steal your bananas, assuming there were bananas back then, and you can't really do anything about it. Or I can invade your entire tribe and take over all your produce, and you have little recourse of property. We were quite savage. We were decentralized and disorderly. It's hard to debate that all centralization is bad. There is good that came from centralization. There are many good things in the world that are a result of centralization. The question today, though, is have we over-centralized? Have we OD'd on centralization? What blockchain allows us to do is it allows us to test, for the first time as a species, it allows us to test hypotheses on what are the things that are currently centralized that we may want to see whether it can exist in a decentralized manner or not. What blockchain allows us to do is it allows us to take things that came from centralization and test a hypothesis to see whether it could exist in a decentralized manner. Now, I know most of you must have heard of Bitcoin. Most of you must have heard of cryptocurrencies. What these are is they are the results of testing a hypothesis to see whether currency could be decentralized. Currency is one of those things that is made from centralization. You just can't decide that you have a currency. Some governing body that has a pool of power has to tell you what a currency is. They tell you what the price is, and they also tell you who can have it and how you can use it. Blockchain is a tool that allowed us to test a hypothesis that says if 200 million of us decide what a currency is between ourselves, decide how it's going to work, and decides the price, who the hell is the government to tell us that that's not a currency? That's the use case of blockchain, to test hypothesis on whether things that were once centralized can exist in a decentralized manner. The first experiment of blockchain tackled a significant hypothesis. Essentially, what is a currency? And over the last 7 years, we've seen thousands of those experiments get played out in one currency after another, one ICO after another, many times impacting local neighborhoods, impacting countries, and reshaping the economic landscape of the world. This is a representation of the ICO market at the end of 2017. This happened in about 4 years. It took us about 1,500 years to figure out fiat currency. Fiat currencies can be measured in the hundreds. Crypto-built currencies can be measured in the thousands. Now, it's no question that most of this is going to be useless. But there are a few, maybe a dozen, maybe 24, that will actually reach the sanctity and the fidelity of fiat currencies. And because they're made in a decentralized way and run in a decentralized way, they will very likely reshape the economic landscape of the world. So the first experiment is ongoing. The question today is, what else should we test? What else is made in a centralized way that we can test to see if it would run in a decentralized manner? Now, there are things such as religion, which is fairly centralized, which we probably should not test. Simply like you shouldn't talk about religion at dinner, you shouldn't test it to see whether it should be decentralized or not. But there are other things. I believe that we are at a point in the maturity of the blockchain protocol where we can start to test something big. Instead of worrying of all the imitations of the first experiment around what is currency, we can create the next 0 to 1 invention by testing something big. Now, what do you think I will want to test? Human rights. I believe we have an opportunity in front of us to test to see whether we can create completely new human rights in a decentralized way. The 30 that are there were fantastic at the time when they were created. It took about 2,500 years to ratify them. They were made in 1948. They're very basic. You have the right to rest. You have the right to protest. You have the right to not be tortured. Well, those problems are over. Well, mostly. But we have other problems in the world. What if we wanted to create the 31st human right? How would we go about it? Some simple mathematics suggest that the first 30, because it took 2,500 years to make them, take about 100 years each to make. We're probably looking at 2118 to make a new human right. Well, let's test it. Human rights usually solve some big humanitarian issue. We just don't arrive at them. It's usually some injustice that is being done that creates the need for a right. A lot of times these injustices are unforeseen byproducts of massive inventions that were created. They're unforeseen byproducts of massive inventions that were created. For example, we didn't know that women couldn't vote until we invented governments. Prior to that, no one asked. So these big inventions usually have negative byproducts, and that gives rise to human rights. One of the negative byproducts of the last 20 years, which consists of the invention of mobile phones, the maturity of the internet, and all of the social networking and rich media that we see, is we've created something that we never imagined would happen. We created a human data marketplace. Our data, your data coming off of your body, is being used in a marketplace. Microsoft bought LinkedIn, and they paid an average of $260 per user for that data. None of that money made it back to the actual users of LinkedIn. You know why? because you don't own your data as property. We don't. There are tons of laws around data privacy, but there's nothing that says my data is property. A good medical record, by a good medical record, I mean someone who's interesting, maybe because they're sick, could sell for $400 to $500 American dollars multiple times a year to multiple buyers. And not a dollar of that goes back to the human being. Our driver records are being sold, on average, about $24 a pop in the United States of America. Sold by the government, by the way. All of your speeding tickets and traffic lights, none of that comes back to us because it's not our property. If you're a doctor, there's a $2 billion industry selling your behaviors and what you prescribe and when you open and what insurance you take. None of that goes back to the doctor. We are sitting in a massive digital humanitarian crisis. Our data is being sold in secondary and tertiary markets to the tune of $200 billion a year, and not a cent comes back to us. But we have human rights. They weren't invented for this style of living. They weren't thought about in 1948. I bet you guys want human right number 31 now. Most of the conversation that's ongoing is around privacy, not property. And I believe we can use blockchain to test the hypothesis that my data is my property. And if it is my property, really interesting things can happen. You can donate your property. Your property can get stolen. This is my favorite car to drive. One of the reasons I love driving this car is because it is the opposite of autonomous driving. Like, there are no systems in it. It's actually kind of dangerous to operate this thing. But it's my property. If it gets stolen, I can go to a local police station and I can file a report because someone stole my car. Do you think that you could go to a local police station and file a report that someone stole your GPS data and is selling it in secondary and tertiary markets so that you can get real-time ads when you pass by Starbucks so they can tell you that they have coffee for sale? You can't. Now, we understand property very well. We do understand information as property as well. There is intellectual property, which is if I draw something, it's my property. I have intellectual property. But if it's inherent data from me, apparently it's not covered. For example, your fingerprint is not your property. I'll give you a really interesting thought experiment. Draw your fingerprint and then go to a lawyer and ask them whether that's your property or not. Poof. It will implode. So I believe that we should test this hypothesis that every human being owns their data forever. And said data is categorized as property as the 31st human right. Now, how do you build a decentralized human right using blockchain? We know how to build it centralized. It takes about 100 years. You have to go to the United Nations. You have to get everyone to agree. You have to spend a lot of money. You have to do a lot of dinners. Then you have to deal with the lobby, who will argue that the data is actually theirs. How do you build it in a decentralized way? Well, we saw what the first experiment was. We used currency innovation with the notion of computer science, and we were able to build a decentralized currency. I think most of you will agree that it is inevitable that some crypto-built currency will reach the sanctity and fidelity of fiat. I believe we can use contract innovation coupled with computer science to agree on what the 31st human right is. Now, what do I mean by contract innovation? All contracts have a begin and an end. All contracts have a way out. Most of the laws that are in place today have a corridor for every single one of us to go to those who are using our data right now and say, hey, I'm okay with you selling my data for the last 20 years, no hard feelings, but from this day onwards, you can't do it anymore because I am stating that this is my property. Most contracts have a method for you to opt out. Contracts you have with Facebook, the contracts you have with LinkedIn, the contracts you have with your doctor, the contracts you have with your hospital, all those things that you sign, there are methods for you to opt out. The question is, can 200 to 300 million of us do it in the same way on a blockchain with cryptographic evidence that that's what we believe, and as a thundering herd declare a 31st human right with no need for the United Nations? That's the big blockchain use case. That's what blockchain does. We're all distracted with the next ICO and the next cryptocurrency, and that's okay, because there's always copycats. But if you really want to take advantage of blockchain, you have to think about what is the next thing that we're going to decentralize. The question is going to be, how do we self-order? Decentralization is fantastic, but you have to learn how to self-order. And there are methods in the protocol that can help us accelerate that. I believe that if we were to go on this road and test this hypothesis, we would forget that there are ICOs, and we will start to think about the IRRs. Or maybe we'll call it something different. IRR doesn't have that ring to it. But the individual renegotiated right, declaring your data as property. I believe that a platform like that, just like we see dozens of currencies that are crypto built that will reach the sanctity and fidelity of fiat currency, I believe that a platform like that will trigger and inspire others to build other human rights, not just the 31st. We might actually be able to build a whole 30 new human rights in the next 100 years, while it took us 2,500 years to build the last 30. The difference is these are going to be decentralized by design. Those were centralized. And we can actually create an entirely new operating model of how we exist. Rights that make sense. I'm sure it made sense that I need rest in 1948. I'm sure it made sense that I should not be tortured in the 1800s. But it also makes sense today that my data is my property. And as a result, when it's used, I should receive consideration for it. If you remember one thing from this talk, remember that this t-shirt is magical. It has two magic powers. I can talk to it, and anytime this t-shirt is used in the future, it has the ability to show us what's happening with it. I'm going to talk to it right now. There, you on? Okay. Well, I'm going to show the audience what I'm going to do with you in the future, and then I'm going to ask you to show us what the future looks like. You cool with that? It says just get on with the show. What I'm going to do with this t-shirt is when I get back home, I'm going to give it to my 3-month-old son. I'm going to give it to Akash. And I'm going to say, Akash, I want you to pass this t-shirt on to your kids with the instructions that they should pass it on to their kids. You have to pick one and pass it on. So hopefully, find some sort of grandchild of mine and pass this t-shirt on, and then have that grandchild pass that t-shirt on to one of my great-grands. Because I want to show this audience today what the future looks like. Are you ready? It says get on with the show. So I want you to show us something in the future that will make sense. What do you want to show us? He wants to show us 3 hours from now. Why? Because I'll be drinking? No. They're not interested in that. Show us something that's relevant. 2118. Interesting. The t-shirt is being worn in 2118, 100 years from now. It's being worn by my great-granddaughter. Apparently her name is Neelam. And the United Nations has an event celebrating the 60th human right that was built decentralized, and they're interviewing her. Are you sure this is going to work? Let's get on with the show.
I'm so thrilled to be here today. I can't even believe that we are already at 60 human rights. In just 100 years, we have defined, implemented, and agreed on an additional 30 human rights, when in the past it took us over 5,000 years just to get the first 30 down. This t-shirt is a representation of where it all started, human right number 31. The right to own your own data as property and be remunerated fairly when it was used by others. My great-grandfather, Richie Etwaru, was a total badass. Like, he was one of those guys who operated his own car and everything. He presented his vision that we need more than just 30 human rights at a TED Talk. Back then, they had these things called TED and TEDx, which were weird to us now, but I guess back then they served a purpose. So basically, people would stand in these dark rooms on peculiar red dots and talk in this overly passionate and corny way, just to be recorded by a few 2D cameras, and they had a live audience, don't ask. Nonetheless, this is how our great-grandparents in their generation spread the word about new revelations back then. This t-shirt reminds me of my great-grandfather and the initial case that data from that human should be owned by them as their own personal property, and then when it's used by others, they should be remunerated fairly for that. I mean, I can't even believe that before the United Nations adopted Article 31, our great-grandparents were being mined and farmed for data and insight without their awareness. So these companies could go and make hundreds of billions of you. Like, it wasn't bad enough that they were already allowed to do all these dangerous things like operate their own cars or stand in dark rooms on little red dots and talk in these overly passionate and corny ways just to get people to listen to them. Our great-grandparents and their whole generation were being mined for data and insight without their consent or awareness about any of that. And they were never getting paid for that.
So my line here is, isn't my great-granddaughter adorable? Ladies and gentlemen, blockchain's biggest use cases allow us to test hypotheses. And we can test hypotheses about things that were built in a centralized way and explore whether they can exist in a decentralized manner or not, just like we did with currencies. To facilitate crypto-built currencies, I give you the crypto-built right. Thank you very much.